All right, John, speaking of problems, I got my own. But 99 problems are my own, but 4 problems are what is the problem with Street Fighter Alpha that I wanted to talk about. There were 4 problems at Capcom that led to the creation of the game. And now the alpha games are actually fairly beloved by many people in the fighting game community now, but they did not start off that way. They started off actually a little bit, but anyway, I wanted to highlight those things that happened at Capcom, 4 of them that led to the creation of the first alpha game, and would later spawn a couple of sequels and other stuff like that. But we're gonna focus here on the original. Now, the
I'm
funny
just
thing
super
about
interested on how you're gonna make talking about CPS boards interesting.
oh hell yeah, that's this is my job, John. I take it seriously. Arcade hardware, man. It's what I grew up on. But one of the classic things here in video games is that uh, when you have a problem, it's you get a bunch of lemons, you got to make lemonade, right? And that's actually basically the theme here of Street Fighter Alpha. So number one thing, they actually sought out to lower the player skill required to play
Hmm.
the game. So what was happening at the time is Street Fighter 2 players had been playing the game for about 3 or 4 years, and arcade operators who basically controlled the entire, they had a lot of influence, I should say, over how the developers made and structured these games. Because
Makes sense.
again, yeah, if I mean they're the ones paying your bills, basically, right? So players would pop in a quarter and they'd play on it for hours sometimes, depending on how many other people came up. And arcade operators are notorious for, like, hey, we want to separate the customer from their money as soon as humanly possible, and someone playing on 1 quarter for an hour is not really ideal for us. And so with Street Fighter Alpha, they actually started off dumbing down the game by adding things like error blocking and chain combos, where if you couldn't do the normal combos and stuff like that, and they wanted it so that less skilled players could win. And it was, we have heard this a lot through the years, that more recently with Guilty Gear Strive, but also with Street Fighter V and a bunch
Mhm.
of other games. But actually, the first time I ever heard this happen was back in 1995 with Street Fighter Alpha, and Capcom was like, "Yeah, we're literally lowering the skill required to play this game, and hope fans enjoy that."
I mean, we feel like it's a newer thing, that the old games and Alpha is regarded as. I mean, it had its absolute time in the competitive spotlight, but like, well, I remember reading through the oral history from Polygon and seeing that and being like, well, that's a headline for any coverage on this because people are going to be shocked at the fact that they've been trying to do this since since the early days.
Yeah. Ugh. So number two, on the problems that led to Alpha, is a short deadline. Shockingly enough, Capcom didn't give their people enough time to complete, a lot of the stuff. Maybe they kind of wanted a shorter game, little bit, and they actually gave the team 3 months initially to make the game. Now that got extended to 6 months actually, but that's actually still fairly mind blowing in this day and age to have such a short development period. But Capcom wanted a more simple game, and they got it. So Alpha's planner at Capcom, the guy who plotted out the game and all that kind of stuff, was actually a relatively new hire, and some of the veterans at Capcom weren't very kind to him, calling him names and saying that he had no talent.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty rough. Now, the end product was overall a success, though. Even if the gameplay wasn't super well thought of by many veterans in the FGC for all the reasons we outlined, even though that messaging wasn't prominent with the game at that time, like, we felt it. Like, we've been playing Street Fighter 2, and it's like, this is, but the game's art was really good. Like, we loved the anime style, like the Street Fighter animated movie had come out at that time, with Ken battling Bison and all that kind of stuff, and there was a really cool homages to that. There was a dynamic battle where you could play 2 characters against Bison. There's some really cool stuff that we're able to squeeze into the game, and so the game held up decently for the time. Like, Alpha 1 was kind of a flash in the pan, and it was interesting that this stuff actually was problematic. 3 months, 6 months of development time is, oh my gosh, and stuff like that. But it actually kind of worked out pretty well in this game's favor for simplifying and all that kind of stuff. You got lemons, you make lemonade. So number three, too much stock. And John, you wanted to hear how I was going to make arcade boards interesting?
I'm
Well,
ready.
Capcom had a surplus of their arcade boards at this time, which led to Alpha One's creation, right? And it's shocking how many times in video game history where there was a problem on the business end, and they expected their developers to solve it for them. So Punch Out, I'm not Mike Tyson's Punch Out, but Punch Out the arcade version was made to use two monitors because Nintendo had a surplus of monitors,
Mm.
and it was a creative way of Miyamoto solving the issue. He's like, well, if we've got a bunch of monitors, let me make a game that utilizes both. Well, Capcom actually did a similar thing with Alpha because they told arcade operators who rolled the planet back then for them that they could send back their CPS-1 boards, which is what like Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition and a bunch of other games ran on. And if they bought the brand new CPS2 setups. And
Mm.
the reason how come Capcom was trying to phase out the CPS1 boards was they were notorious for being too easy to pirate games on, which led to all those Street Fighter games where you could do air fireballs, the rainbow editions, all that kind of stuff. You change characters by pressing the start button. That was all pirated stuff that Capcom hated. The CPS2 setups were actually notoriously difficult to crack. It took the hacking community a long time to actually figure it out. I think it was only 10.
Let's get all
Yeah.
that back. Bring those back in.
But anyway, so arcade operators traded in a bunch of their CPS-1 boards and got a bunch of CPS-2 boards, and that ran Super Street Fighter 2 and a bunch of other modern games. But what Capcom did is they actually made it so that Alpha could run on either the CPS-1 or CPS-2 hardware. It was one of the few games that they made that could run on both, and so they basically got that surplus of CPS-1 hardware. They're like, well, let's make a game that can take advantage of this, right? Let's we've got just a bunch of hardware sitting here now that everyone traded it in. Let's make a game that can actually run this stuff, and they did, and it worked out. It was like, hey, that was actually a very creative solution from their team at the time, and it made sense from a business standpoint, and we got a solid game out of it. So was that
I think you
interesting,
did it.
John?
I was
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
I was
okay,
interested
yeah.
because I read that knowing like CPS board. I had no real strong idea of what a CPS board is and stuff like that. The general gist of it, but yeah, no, that was interesting. And that particularly what I appreciated was the fact that I didn't realize that it was because they were so hackable. They're
Yeah.
like, oh, we gotta. I can imagine feeling that way. Like if you're that team and you're like, we just released all these things and people are basically changing our game and we can't do much about it. Let's just make this big corporate push to try to get them back in some way. So it was creative and it's a good idea.
Yeah.
And like the out of necessity things that happen through history are they tend to be pretty interesting. So
Yeah,
I
very good.
give you a B plus.
All right, sweet. I'll take it. Number 4, the final one. Capcom was breaking their own rules. Capcom was allowed to do their own thing here by making a game that could run well on consoles, which was something they tried to avoid at that time. The main consoles back then were the Sega Saturn and the original PlayStation, which both ran the game actually near perfectly. Although the edge was kind of overall given, like I played on both versions, and like the PlayStation was like I think better overall for having like more animation, more frame rates and stuff. And usually back then the Sega Saturn ports like for 2D games were quite a bit better. And just to give a little bit of evidence of this, like how much Capcom would butcher their arcade ports to consoles. X-Men versus Street Fighter on the PlayStation, they didn't even allow you to tag into the other character. Like the other character, like you could pick two characters on the select screen and all that, right? But that other character wouldn't show up unless it was like for certain moves like supers and other stuff like that due to memory limitations on the PlayStation. So like imagine a verse game where it's not even like you don't even really have a team, so to speak. You're really just kind of playing a solo character, and it was if you liked X-Men versus Street Fighter and you got the PlayStation version, you were like, what the hell is this? It just, yeah. So
It's funny when they ported Street Fighter Ultra over to PlayStation 4, Street Fighter 4, it had a lot of problems too. I don't know if you've heard about that.
Yeah, I might have heard about that just a little bit ago, but yes, very, very good point. So anyway, Capcom sports back then were almost never arcade perfect, as they had built up their arcade business a ton. They wanted to make sure their arcade business was very sustainable with all the consoles coming in. Both things were important, but it's like you don't want to cannibalize, one avenue that you're making a lot of money on, right? So the developers, they designed games that ran super well on their arcade hardware and didn't, do as well on the consoles. But Alpha was an exception to that. Since it was a more simple game, they told the developers they could make it run super well on the consoles and it would be okay because, we're just trying to move the hardware out, and we're trying to make some new stuff here. So Capcom actually broke their own rule at the time of making, an arcade perfect port on the consoles basically. And so it was kind of an interesting thing. It kind of helped, Alpha has a really kind of checkered past, especially now, like very few people like speak fondly of the original Alpha game, but they had all these kind of interesting nuances that went into the game's development, and kind of made it like a notable point in fighting game history, and just kind of seeing how these things have to work. The business into things is very important, right?
Mhm.
So
Today we've talked a lot about, and in the other segment, about how like Capcom's development team has kind of fumbled things in various ways, whether it be PR or actual execution in the games. I want to say, with all the wood knocked on in the world, that despite being hyper aware of all of these things, having lived through some of them, having read through some of them, I do feel like where Capcom is now with their fighting game division, I have a lot of faith going into Street Fighter 6, that they will have learned a lot of these lessons and not have to learn them for like the eighth time, which that tends to be like they have to learn a lot of the same lessons over and over again. I'm thinking we might have crossed through, again, knock wood, crossed through a threshold where things are going to start with a little more of a running start than they have before.
yeah, that's pretty darn fair. I'm hoping the same thing, but we'll see. Hopefully he didn't just jinx the entire community.
I knocked wood like 80 times. It's fine.